What does it take to shatter the composure of Hollywood's most beloved gentleman? What force could be so potent, so corrosive, that it could push a man universally celebrated for his kindness, his talent, and his boundless charisma to the very brink? And what if that force was not a villain from one of his blockbuster films, but a celebrated icon of truth and comedy? This is not a story about a fleeting red carpet spat or a misquoted interview. This is the story of a war of ideals, a clash of philosophies fought under the brightest, harshest lights of American television. It's the story of how Hugh Jackman, the seemingly unbreakable man, faced off against the titan of satire, Jon Stewart. In a confrontation so seismic, it didn't just create headlines, it erased an entire television empire. This is the story of the interview that was never supposed to happen, and the night a quiet word proved more devastating than the loudest accusation. The autumn of 2024 was classic New York. A sharp, promising chill had descended upon Manhattan, turning the leaves in Central Park to fiery shades of amber and crimson. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy, the city humming with the familiar rhythm of ambition and purpose. For Hugh Jackman, this energy was the fuel he'd run on for months. He was deep into a grueling 8-show-a-week run of a new, emotionally demanding musical on Broadway, a production called The Atlas Strain. It was a complex role, requiring him to be a titan of industry one moment and a broken, grieving father the next, with a vocal score that would challenge singers half his age. His days were a testament to discipline. Mornings began before sunrise in his West Village apartment, with a punishing workout in his home gym. The clank of weights a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant wail of city sirens. This was followed by a quiet hour with his family, a sacred space of normalcy, before the whirlwind began. By late morning, he was often at the Laughing Man coffee shop, the foundation he'd co-founded, not for a photo op, but to connect with the mission, to remember the faces of the Colombian farmers his work supported. It grounded him. The smell of roasting beans, the low murmur of conversation, it was real, tangible. The afternoons were for vocal coaching, physical therapy, and then, as dusk settled, the transformation. He'd walk to the theater, a journey of a little over a mile, feeling the city's pulse. Inside the hallowed walls of the Schubert Theater, the scent of old velvet dust and grease paint was his church. He would become another man, pouring every ounce of his emotional and physical being onto the stage. At 56, he was in peak physical condition, but the strain was immense, a weight he carried with a practiced public grace. His psyche was one of quiet fortitude. He believed in the work. He believed in the power of stories. And he believed, perhaps naively, in the fundamental goodness of people. Miles downtown in a studio on the West Side Highway, another kind of energy was brewing. It was a more cynical, frantic energy. This was the headquarters of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Stewart, having returned to the desk 2 years prior to a nation more divided than ever, was at the zenith of his second act. He was no longer just a comedian. He was an institution, the nation's wry, exasperated conscience. The air in his writer's room was thick with intellectual combat, littered with cold pizza boxes and the ghosts of 1,000 discarded jokes. Stewart, now in his early 60s, presided over it all with a familiar blend of weariness and laser-focused intensity. He had spent decades deconstructing power, exposing hypocrisy with a surgeon's precision. But lately a subtle shift had occurred. The targets had become softer, the barbs more personal. The world had become so absurd, so cartoonishly corrupt, that taking down a politician felt like shooting fish in a barrel. He was bored. He needed a new kind of target, a new kind of hypocrisy to dissect. And in his eyes, he found it in the unassailable, universal adoration of Hugh Jackman. It bothered him. It felt unreal. No one was that perfect, that beloved, that nice. To Stewart's increasingly cynical worldview, such a flawless public image couldn't be authentic. It had to be a brand, a meticulously crafted product, as artificial as a Hollywood backlot. He saw the gym selfies, the heartwarming family anecdotes, the earnest charity work, and he didn't see a good man. He saw a masterful performance. And Jon Stewart's job, as he saw it, was to pull back the curtain. The stage was set not on Broadway, but in the court of public opinion. And the opening act was about to begin, unbeknownst to the man who was simply trying to get through another demanding week. The first shot was fired on a Tuesday night. It was subtle, almost a throwaway line. During a segment on corporate virtue, signaling Stewart flashed a picture of Jackman holding a cup of Laughing Man coffee. And here we have Hugh Jackman. Stewart began a wry smile playing on his lips. A man who wants you to know that he's not just a multimillionaire movie star. No, he's a caring multimillionaire movie star. This cup of coffee isn't just a beverage, it's a chalice of moral superiority. Drink up, and you too can feel good about your place in the universe. The studio audience laughed as they always did. It was a gentle jab standard Stewart fare. Jackman, when he heard about it the next day, brushed it off. It came with the territory. But it didn't stop. The following night, Stewart dedicated a full 3 minutes to what he mockingly called the Jackman Doctrine. He juxtaposed clips of Jackman's intense, violent portrayal of Wolverine with saccharine-sweet interview sound bites about his love for his family and tap dancing. So which is it? Stewart pondered, leaning into the camera. Is he the rage-fueled berserker gutting bad guys for profit? Or the song and dance man who just wants to make the world a better place? One organic fair trade coffee bean at a time. Or maybe, just maybe, they're the same thing, a brilliant marketing strategy. Now Jackman's publicist was concerned. "Ignore it, Hugh," she advised over the phone. "Don't get into a mud wrestling match with a pig. You both get dirty and the pig likes it." He agreed. He had a show to do. He had a family to focus on. But the attacks became a recurring segment, a running gag that slowly morphed into a crusade. Stewart's team of researchers, the best in the business, began digging. They pulled up decade-old interviews, isolated out-of-context quotes, and presented them as a pattern of calculated image building. The narrative Stewart was weaving was insidious. Hugh Jackman's kindness was a lie. The tipping point came 2 weeks into the campaign. It was no longer about Jackman's persona. It was an attack on his integrity. In a meticulously edited segment, Stewart's team traveled to Colombia, not to speak to the farmers. Laughing Man actually helped, but to find a handful of disgruntled former employees of a third-party distributor. They spliced their vague complaints with images of Jackman on red carpets, creating a disgusting false equivalence. The segment culminated with Stewart looking into the camera, his face a mask of faux sincerity. "We're not saying the charity is a scam," he said, the words dripping with implication. "We're just asking for a man who has built an empire on authenticity. How much of this is just another performance, and who is the real beneficiary of all this? Goodness." That night, Jackman watched the segment online after his show, the grease paint still smeared on his forehead. The attack on his acting, his image, he could handle, but this was different. This was an attack on his fatherhood, on the lessons he taught his children, on the memory of the farmer Ducali, whose story had inspired the entire foundation. It was a poison dart aimed at the very core of his character. His wife, Deborah Lee, saw the look in his eyes, a cold, quiet fire she hadn't seen in years. The publicist's advice to ignore it now felt like cowardice. Silence was beginning to look like an admission of guilt. The next morning, Jackman made a call. Not to his publicist, not to his agent, but directly to the booking producer of The Daily Show. "This is Hugh Jackman," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I believe Jon wanted to ask me some questions. Tell him I'll be there, whenever he wants." The news sent a shockwave through both camps. Stewart's team was ecstatic, sensing a kill shot. Jackman's team was horrified, convinced he was walking into a public execution. "You can't win, Hugh," his agent pleaded. "He controls the edit, the audience, the narrative. It's his arena." "I'm not going there to win," Jackman replied, his voice chillingly serene. "I'm going there to talk." The interview was set for Thursday. The Gladiator had accepted the invitation to the Coliseum. The air inside Studio 52 was electric, but it wasn't the warm, convivial energy of a typical talk show taping. It was the tense, charged atmosphere of a prize fight. The audience, loyal Stewart disciples, buzzed with anticipation. They had come for a takedown to see the king of satire expose the saint of Hollywood. When Hugh Jackman walked onto the set, the applause was polite but hesitant. He wasn't dressed in a flashy suit but in a simple dark sweater and jeans. He looked tired, his face etched with the fatigue of his Broadway schedule, but his eyes were clear and direct. He sat down a small island of calm in a sea of judgment. Jon Stewart, by contrast, was in his element. He leaned back in his chair, a predator enjoying the sight of his prey willingly entering the cage. He began with a few easy questions about the Broadway show, lulling the audience, and perhaps Jackman into a false sense of security. Then the pivot. "So Hugh," Stewart said, his tone shifting from collegial to prosecutorial, "we've been talking a lot on this show about this image you have, this incredibly, wholesome persona." On the giant screen behind them, a montage began to play, Jackman laughing with children, Jackman crying in an interview about his father, Jackman earnestly describing the mission of Laughing Man Coffee. The clips were edited with a subtle, mocking slow motion, the audio sweetened to sound almost syrupy. The audience chuckled. Jackman didn't watch the screen. He watched Stewart. When the clip ended, Stewart leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "It's a beautiful story, it really is. But my job, as I see it, is to ask questions. So I have to ask how much of that is real, and how much is just the greatest role you've ever played." This was the moment everyone was waiting for. The attack. Jackman was expected to get defensive, to list his good deeds, to argue the facts. Instead, he did something no one, least of all Stewart, anticipated. He remained silent for a long beat, letting the accusation hang in the air. The silence stretched from uncomfortable to excruciating. The studio was dead quiet. Then Jackman leaned forward, mirroring Stewart's posture, and in a low, almost conversational voice he spoke. "You're right, Jon," he said. The admission stunned Stewart into a flicker of confusion. "It is a role." Jackman paused again, then continued. "Every day I play the role of a man who is patient when he wants to be angry. I play the role of a man who gets up at 4 a.m. to train when his body is screaming to stay in bed. I play the role of a father who has all the answers for his kids when God knows I have none of them. I play the role of a man who believes in the good in people, even on days when the world shows him very little of it." He looked directly at Stewart, and his voice was devoid of anger. It was filled with a profound, weary sadness. "It's the hardest role I've ever had, but I play it. Not for them." He gestured to the unseen cameras. "But for me, because I know who I am when I don't. And I don't like that man very much. We all play that role, Jon, the role of the person we hope to be. Don't you?" The question turned the entire interview on its head. It was no longer an interrogation of Jackman. It was a mirror held up to Stewart. The host, for the first time in memory, was momentarily speechless. He tried to recover, to pivot back to the charity. But the questions about the foundation. Jackman cut him off, not with aggression, but with quiet authority. "You sent a team to Colombia, Jon. You spent thousands of dollars to find dirt on a coffee company, a company that pays 100% of its profits to its farmers and their communities. You could have funded a new well for a village with that money. You could have sent a dozen kids to school." He shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity in his eyes. "You used to be the guy who spoke truth to power. You took on corrupt politicians, manipulative media empires, systemic injustice. You were brilliant. You were important. But now, you're sending your best investigative team after a coffee shop. What happened? Who are you angry at, Jon, because it can't possibly be me?" The final decisive blow wasn't a shout. It was a whisper. Stewart opened his mouth to retort, to land a punchline, but nothing came out. The well of wit had run dry, replaced by a raw, exposed nerve. The audience was utterly still. The giddy anticipation replaced by a deeply uncomfortable sense of witnessing something too real, too intimate. They had come to see a crucifixion, and were instead watching a man's soul being laid bare on live television. Jackman looked from Stewart's stunned face to the audience, then back to Stewart. He gave a small, sad smile. "The funniest man on television has forgotten the difference between a punchline and a punch," he said softly. "And that's not a tragedy for me, Jon. It's a tragedy for you." With that, he unclipped the small microphone from his sweater, placed it gently on the table, and stood up. He nodded once to the silent host, turned, and walked off the stage. The cameras followed him until he disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Jon Stewart alone at his desk, bathed in the glare of the studio lights, in a silence more damning than any heckle he had ever endured. The immediate aftermath was chaos and silence, a paradox of panic. Backstage producers were shouting into headsets while on stage Jon Stewart remained frozen at his desk. The show's director, unsure of what to do, cut to a commercial, but the damage was irreparable. The live broadcast had ended, but the real story was just beginning. Within minutes, unofficial clips of Jackman's final speech filmed on cell phones in the audience began to surface on social media. By the time the official show-sanctioned clip was posted, it was already going supernova. The narrative didn't just flip, it was annihilated. The viral moment wasn't Hugh Jackman fights back. It was Hugh Jackman dismantles Jon Stewart with kindness. The conversation wasn't about the charity, it was about Stewart's methods. Words like bully, cruel, and cynic began trending alongside his name. Stewart, the master dissector of media narratives, had become the subject of the most damning one of his career, and he had written the script himself. By Friday morning, the fallout was catastrophic. Two major corporate sponsors, a car manufacturer and a tech giant, announced they were re-evaluating their advertising relationship with the show, a corporate death sentence. The network's switchboard was flooded with calls, not from the usual political outrage groups, but from ordinary viewers expressing disgust. They felt complicit in a public mugging. Stewart's own writers, a team that revered him, were reportedly shaken, forced to confront the reality that the line between satire and cruelty had been crossed. Stewart issued a public statement, a stilted apology that spoke of pushing the boundaries of comedy and regretting if the segment was misconstrued. But it was too little too late. The words rang hollow. He had built his brand on dissecting insincere apologies, and now he was delivering one of his own. The public saw through it instantly. He had lost his most valuable asset, his credibility. The network placed The Daily Show on an indefinite hiatus the following week, citing the need to retool the show's creative direction. It was a gentle execution. The show never returned. The empire Stewart had built, the cultural institution that had shaped a generation's political understanding, was gone. It wasn't canceled by the government or silenced by corporate overlords. It was undone by a single, quiet conversation. It died of a self-inflicted wound in the middle of its own arena. Hugh Jackman, for his part, never spoke of the incident again. He was seen the next day at his coffee shop, and that evening he delivered a particularly powerful performance in The Atlas Strain. He had won not by raising his voice, but by knowing his soul. He had walked into the lion's den, and instead of fighting the lion, he had simply shown it its own reflection, and the beast had recoiled. The ultimate message from that fateful night resonated far beyond the world of television. It was a powerful lesson in the nature of strength. In a world that often mistakes cynicism for intelligence and mockery for wit, true power lies in unwavering integrity. It taught us that you cannot build yourself up by tearing another person down, and that satire, when it loses its empathy, ceases to be comedy and becomes mere cruelty. Jackman's victory was a testament to the idea that authenticity, raw and vulnerable, is a shield that no amount of sarcasm can ever pierce. He reminded us that the goal isn't to be untouched by the darkness in the world, but to be the person who can walk through it without letting it extinguish your own light. So what do you think? Was Hugh Jackman's response the only way to win, or was it simply the most effective? Have we as a culture become too accepting of cruelty when it's disguised as comedy? Where is the line for you and who gets to draw it? We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. This was a story about more than just two famous people. It was about the ideas that shape our public discourse and the character we choose to show the world. If this story made you think, please give this video a like, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful narrative, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the defining moments that we can all learn from. Remember the central lesson. In the noisy battle for attention, sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks its truth quietly and without compromise.